we've got the bench test results of the new Onkyo TX-RZ70 11.2 channel AV receiver. Is this the best receiver for under $3,000? That's what we're going to be talking about in today's video. Hey folks, I'm Gene Delasalo with Audioholics. You guys saw I was very enthusiastic of my unboxing video of the TX-RZ70 receiver from Onkyo. This thing is a beast, and I could not wait to get it on my bench test. And let me tell you guys, it was not a disappointment. I did an exhaustive report. It's on audioholics.com. I'll put the link down below to the full editorial. But I think it's important to go over these results with you guys so you can grasp what I'm seeing here on my test bench and why I'm so excited about this AV receiver. So I'm going to share my screen now and we can go over all of these awesome, juicy results. So here it is. This receiver is about 50 pounds. So it's the heaviest in its class. I think the closest would be like the Yamaha RX-8A, RX-A8A. I think that one's close to 50 pounds as well. This thing is really a beast. It's 11 channels of amplification. It's rated at 140 watts times 11. And I got some excited news in my power results that you'll see on that. Now, this receiver shares a platform with Pioneer as well as Integra. Integra is a sister company. It's more the premier line for the brand. They're very similar receivers. In fact, they have the same exact amp sections, the same DACs. They all use the ESS 9026 Pro Saber DACs. Those are 8-channel DACs, very good DACs. Pretty much virtually identical. There's a couple of different features that I talk about in this article. The Integra has an XLR input and it's got XLR outputs for the LCRs and the subwoofers. The Pioneer has XLR input and an XLR output for the front, left, and right. They have all three of these receivers have dual independent sub outs. The Integra and Pioneer versions give you parallel versions, so you can connect up to 4 subs, but only 2 of those connections are independent. But this is the kind of sweet spot here in terms of price, because this one's at $2,800. The Pioneer is at $3,000, and the Integra is at $3,200. Now, the Onkyo and the Integra are THX Select, whereas the Pioneer is not. And then you get, Pioneer's room correction if you go that route, and you get the AccuQ for Integra and Onkyo. All three offer Dirac Live, and they give you, that's for free. So there's no licensing fee. You have to pay for the Dirac Live. And if you want to upgrade to Dirac Live Bass Control, there are fees associated depending on how many subwoofers you want to support. But I just want to focus on the test bench results. And we're going to be doing follow-up videos. I'm going to do one on the web interface. We're going to do a full review with listening tests, Dirac implementation, you name it. We're going to be covering this receiver very thoroughly. In fact, I don't think you'll find any more detailed coverage anywhere else on this product. I'm so excited about this product that I want to just give you guys all of the information. The one thing I want to tell you is all of my tests are done in the default high impedance mode, or 6 ohms or more. I'm going to repeat this multiple times until it sinks into you guys. Never mess with the impedance switch. It's a disaster if you go to the low setting. You'll see it in my results. I've seen this before on every other AVR I've tested. I think this Onkyo has the worst impedance switch I've ever seen. It's just, it'll neuter everything with this receiver if you put it to the low setting, regardless of your loudspeaker impedance. So let's start with the preamp section. I know there's a lot of people that want to use an AVR as a dedicated preamp. It's a more cost-effective route in most cases than buying a preamp. And sometimes you just want to up the power of your front 3 LCRs. You could certainly do that here. The preamp section on the Onkyo is excellent. I've seen this with Integra before with the DRX 4.3 I reviewed years ago. Very clean preamp outputs, flat to 50 kilohertz. I think it's like 1.7 dB down at the limit of my test gear, like 85K. So very good analog pure direct mode here. I measured the SINAD. It's almost 100 dB, so it's very low distortion on the outputs. You get a clean 4 volts RMS. It gets, some of the channels have a little bit higher distortion when you get to around 2 or 3 volts, but we're talking a SINAD of 86 dB which is still like 0.005%, you're splitting hairs. You cannot hear it to the tenths of the thousandths of a place on distortion. So don't go and chase sine ed. That's not for this channel. That's for other channels. And you can see here, I've graphed all the channels, all 7 channels, because I test 7 channels at a time, voltage versus distortion. You get a good clean 3.5, 4 volts here, no problem. Any modern amplifier will drive to clipping before the preamp of the Onkyo clips itself. Now, the Onkyo also offers a preamp disconnect mode. I'm happy to see this feature. I've been asking for this for years. I started with Denon and Marantz, and they were the first to implement this, and now everybody's following suit. The advantage here is if you're not using the amp sections, you physically disconnect the preamp from the power amp. That way you're not overdriving an unloaded amplifier, and you don't get any noise or distortion ingressing back into the preamp section. It does not turn off the amplifiers. Let me just be clear about that. It just physically disconnects that coupling path. Now, you could do this on the Onkyo. You can either disconnect the front amps or you could disconnect all the amps. It gives you that option. I think that's great. Didn't see much of a difference in noise and distortion, maybe a little bit lower distortion with the preamp disconnect engaged. So if you aren't going to engage the amplifiers, I would definitely recommend using preamp disconnect. It's a good feature to have. You can see it's got a clean FFT output at 2 volts RMS. The third harmonic is like 94 dB below the fundamental. No power supply issues, no grounding problems here. You can see the spectrum is very clean. There's no bumps at 60 hertz or 120 hertz. The spikes above 2-3 kilohertz are pretty low. I'm very pleased with this result. Now, when you look at the signal to noise ratio of the preamp, when I'm driving 0 dBFS, which is digital full scale HDMI, and I measure 2 volts RMS out, I get 112 dB or 110 on the worst channel. That's excellent. That's among the best lowest noise preamps that I've measured, even in dedicated pre-pro. So kudos to Onkyo. They've got a nice preamp section on this receiver. Looking at the bass management here, because it's a THX rated AVR, you get textbook crossovers. You get second order on the high pass, fourth order on the low pass, just like we like to see it. And I'm assuming the Pioneer would be the same, even though it's not THX. They have the same DSP and the same DACs and the same bass management stuff. So rest assured the bass management on this AVR is excellent. Now, the one downside, and this is again on paper more than reality, as if it really matters in real world, is the DSP is limited to 48 kilohertz. So once you engage the bass management, your sampling rate, even if you bring in a 192 kilohertz signal, it downsamples to 48 kilohertz. Not a huge deal. I know some of the Yamaha, Denon, and Marantz counterparts will give you the full 96K sampling rate. They won't downsample for bass management engaged. This AVR does. My $24,000 Storm ISP also downsamples to 48K. And if you engage Dirac, I believe most systems using Dirac downsample to 48K anyway, so it's not a big deal. I just wanted to at least bring this to your attention in case you were wondering. Onkyo has this feature called standing wave correction, and I thought at first it was a manual PEQ, and I got all excited for those that like to tweak and do their own manual calibrations. Personally, I like to go in, even when I run room correction like Odyssey, I go in and I adjust biquad filters and I put finishing touches so I can get rid of some room modal problems that maybe the room correction system didn't do. And you could do this if you have selectable frequency, Q, which is the bandwidth, and then amplitude. Unfortunately, the Onkyo standing wave manual EQ has a fixed Q of about 2, and it affects all the channels, not just the subwoofer channel. You can't select one channel or the other. And this is what happens when you set it to 60 hertz. You can see it's a very wide correction, and it does it to all the channels. So as far as I'm concerned, this is a feature that needs to mature. Onkyo could do better here. I would really like to see a 3 or 4 band manual PEQ like you get with Yamaha. All of Yamaha's AVRs now have manual PEQ, and they go down to like, I think 16 hertz. So please, Onkyo, if you're listening, please give us manual PEQ for those that are old-fashioned that want to do their own manual tweaking. I would greatly appreciate that. I tested the different filter DAC settings, and it's marginally different whether you're using the sharp or you're using the short roll-off. there's just a little bit more roll off in one of the filters versus the other. Personally, I just use auto. I don't like to prematurely roll off before 20 kilohertz. Now, this only affects the sampling rate of 44.1 kilohertz. If you go to a sampling of 96 kilohertz, the filters look virtually identical because it's so far out of band, it doesn't really matter. I did some out of band noise measurements here, and you can see the difference between auto versus sharp. Very similar again, just a little less roll off here for this particular one, for the slow one. Supposedly that gives you better transient response, but I don't know about you. I can't hear to 20 or 25 kilohertz, certainly not 25 kilohertz. So not that big of a deal. There's some noise shaping going on here. I'm not sure what Onkyo is doing, but it's so down in the mud at 130 dB. I'm not losing sleep over that. That's a good measurement right there. And then the last measurement here for the noise spectra, I did a sampling rate of 96K versus 192K, so you can see the noise spectra, and everything looks great here. You get half of Nyquist, so the roll-off is at about 48 kilohertz for the 96 kilohertz sampling rate. Very clean, very low noise out of band. Excellent. Now let's get on to the power measurements. So we measure power in 3 different ways. We do continuous full power bandwidth from 20 to 20K per FTC for up to 2 channels driven. 1 kilohertz power sweeps, that's for 7 channels driven at a time. And then we do burst test dynamic power that kind of simulates music program material. And we do that for 2 channels as well as 7 channels. And typically when we do 4 ohms on AVRs, we only test for 2 channels because I just don't want to overtax an AVR with 7 channels at 4 ohms. It's kind of unrealistic. So we can see here the power bandwidth on the TX-RZ70 is excellent. This is with 7 channels driven, and the roll off is the 3 dB points like it's 77 kilohertz. Very linear response as we would expect from a linear amplifier. I tested at 264 watts at 4 ohms, 2 channels driven. This thing is a beast. We got very low distortion under like 0.05%. That's with both channels driven from 20 to 20 kilohertz. That is impressive. I just could not believe that. Even though this amp is rated at 140 watts a channel, it delivered 170 watts a channel with 2 channels driven at 8 ohms, full bandwidth. This is a very conservatively rated AVR. In fact, the Integra and Pioneer models are rated at 150 watts a channel, whereas the Onkyo is rated at 140. I'm going to go out on a limb and say they're all identical. They just derated the Onkyo to differentiate the brands because they all have the same power consumption, which we'll talk about in a minute. But this is conservative rating here because I've been hard on Onkyo in the past. I did an article on receiver power ratings, truth and power, and I put Onkyo as an example of one that was inflating power along with many of the other brands that were doing Atmos receivers. In this case, Onkyo is being more like NAD, but giving you a lot of muscle behind it. They're telling you it's 140 watts. You're getting way more because it has such a huge power supply in this thing. It's got 4 rows of heat sinks. This is a juggernaut of an AVR. I don't know of any other AVR that puts out this kind of power at $3,000 or less. And I wanted to show you the sign ad on here. Again, very low distortion amplifier. And Onkyo touts that their amplifier is a wide bandwidth, low distortion. You can see we got about a sign ad of 85 dB here. That's excellent. We're talking about 0.005% THD plus N, and that's at 50 watts. So that's a very low noise, very low distortion amplifier. Now, here's the fun part. When we go and sweep this at 1 kilohertz with 7 channels driven, I've never measured an AVR at $3,000 that gave me 133 watts a channel, 7 channels driven at 8 ohms at 1%, and 118 watts at 0.1%. That's better than what I measured on the more expensive Marantz SR8015, which did about 100 watts under the same test conditions and 92 watts at 0.1%. So this has got more power capability than a $3,500, $4,000 receiver. That's impressive that Onkyo was able to give you such a stable power supply that it's able to deliver this kind of power. And when you look at it at 4 ohms with 2 channels driven, we got 266 watts at 0.1% and 300 watts at 1%, both channels driven. That's massive. Now, here's the problem. There's going to be someone in the comments that say, I've got 4-ohm speakers. I'm going to switch to the 4-ohm mode. Don't do it. Look what happens when you do it. It absolutely neuters the amplifier. You go from 300 watts at 4 ohms down to like 47 watts at 0.1% and 54 watts at 1%. You absolutely destroy all the benefits of having a big flagship receiver like this when you mess with that impedance switch. Do not do it. Not only does it kill your power, it raises distortion. It just doesn't do anything beneficial at all. It's there for that BS FTC rating to get the 4-ohm rating, for liability. But I tested this receiver. I torture tested this. I ran sweeps for minutes at a time at 4 ohms. And all that happened was the fans gently turned on. They weren't very audible. The receiver stayed cool. This is a very stable platform because there's a lot of iron. We've got a lot of heatsink area here. Onkyo put the money where it counts and gave us a real meaty power supply, good output devices, lots of heatsink area to keep this receiver running cool. I can't be more enthusiastic about what we're seeing here for under $3,000. I wanted to show you the dynamic power. This is what I was telling you about that simulates program material. So at 4 ohms, we've got 370 watts, 2 channels driven. That is awesome. I think I calculated about 1.8 dB dynamic headroom on this receiver when you compare it to its 140 watt rating. That's great. I mean, it reminds me back in the day when we used to have these integrated amps. There was a brand called Proton. They used to tout they had 2 dB of dynamic headroom. This is very close to that. And this is an AVR that's got 11 channels built into it. So kudos again to Onkyo. I am just going to give them the badass award for this AVR. This is a badass receiver just based on this test that I'm seeing here, all these different results here. And I've got the tabulated results. If you want to look at them into more detail with 2 channels driven, 7 channels driven, you could read all this. Again, this is on the editorial site. I'll put a link in the description below. And then the crosstalk is pretty good. I've seen better crosstalk channel-to-channel isolation on other AVRs, but it's nothing to be worried about. I think it's close to 50 or 60 dB at 20 kilohertz from channel to channel. I wanted to tell you guys about the power consumption on the back. So I did a video on AV receiver power consumption because people get confused. Some of these AVRs, they say 500 or 600 watts on the back, and they're giving you 130 watt or 140 watt rating for continuous power. How could that be when the power consumption on the back doesn't add up? Well, unless it says max power consumption, which this does not. This says 1,095 watts. I found out through research that that's based on each channel driven at 1/8 power. And if you're on a linear amp, that's where it's the least efficient. So we're talking 20% efficiency. So when you take 11 channels at 1/8 power, factor in 20% efficiency, you come up with expending about 963 watts. Then you add some processing on top of that for DSP and HDMI. You're right at that 1,095 watt rating. Now, you saw before when I measured this, I got 130 watts a channel times 7. And when you do this calculation and assume about 60% efficiency, because you're at, the higher power rating for the amplifier where it's more efficient, and you factor in the DSP processing, we're consuming close to 1,600 watts. So this thing has a serious power supply in it, close to what a 15 amp wall outlet will give you. You're close to what you can get from a 15 amp wall outlet on this AVR. And it's the same thing with the Integra and the Pioneer. They're all rated the same power consumption. So again, I'm going to go out on a limb and say all 3 receivers have the same power. It's just they're derating the Onkyo to differentiate the brand. But very good results here. I just cannot be happier with that. Look at how beautiful the design of this receiver is with the large E-core in the center, the 4 heat sinks, nice output devices, lots of iron. Those fans are really cool running. Look at the heat sinking on the HDMI. I know Onkyo has had notorious issues in the past with HDMI reliability. I think a lot of that has been addressed in the latest AVRs, because they're teamed up with Pioneer. And you can see the effort that they put in these boards. It's just a beautifully well executed design. And guys, I hope you appreciate the depth of what we did here. And if you can use our affiliate links, it would be great. So I got this receiver through Audio Device. They're one of our channel partners. If you are considering buying this AVR, I would please recommend that you use our affiliate links below. Sometimes they'll be running sales or promotions on it. I know the Pioneer model is currently on sale. The Onkyo one, I think, is my favorite of the three, just aesthetically looking. I really like the way the Onkyo looks. I also like the Pioneer as well, and the Integra is no slouch, but I've always had an affinity for the Onkyo brand. Back in the day when I was a kid growing up in high school, and I would always gawk at the flagship AVRs, it was, to me, the top three were Denon, Yamaha, and Onkyo. So I'm really pleased to see Onkyo is back in the game with this receiver. And they did something that's really great. So in older models like the Integra DRX 4.3, when I would bench test that and it would go into fault protection, the receiver would shut off. I'd go and turn it back on, and it would stay in low power mode. And the only way to fix that, and when I'm saying low power mode, that means that it wouldn't deliver more than 30 or 40 watts a channel. The only way to fix that would be to unplug it from the wall and then plug it back in and turn it on, and then you'd be back in high power mode. And I wrote about this years ago, and it's been a problem with Onkyo and Pioneer and Integra receivers for years. Not a problem with the TX-RZ70. What happens when you go into fault protection is the receiver shuts off, you go and turn it back on, and it tests each amplifier for a short to make sure there's no problems. It takes about 2 minutes. Once it does that, the receiver goes to normal operating mode, so it's not in some weird low power mode. I love the fact that Onkyo took that feedback, no pun intended, and they fixed it and they improved it, and they gave you a function that's really important, because if your receiver is shutting off, it's either going to do it on a test bench because I'm abusing it with test signals, or you have a short on a speaker. So you don't want to have a short on a speaker and keep running this thing into protection. The fact that it has a diagnostic mode and it goes through each channel and it'll identify whatever channel has the short is great. So again, I love this AVR. If I was on the market right now to spend $3,000 on an AVR, this would be the one I would get. The only thing that would give me reservation is if I wanted to go beyond 11 channels. So if you want to go beyond 11 channels, then you got to step up to a Denon AVR 6800H or a Marantz Cinema 30, or an Anthem MRX 1140. None of those AVRs have a meatier amp section than this. This has a class-leading amp section. So if you're planning on using this at reference level and you want to drive 4-ohm speakers and you want to have the best possible output to your speakers, you're not going to match this for the $3,000 asking price, or in this case, $2,800. It's that good. And I don't often get this gushing over a product, but I just have to tip my hat off to Onkyo for putting so much effort into the analog section of this amplifier. So guys, if you like this video, please hit the thumb up, hit subscribe. Don't forget about our Patreon channel at patreon.com/Audioholics. We appreciate your support. You get direct access to me if you want to suggest video topics. And until next time, my friends, keep listening.